All right. Happy whatever day you're watching this, everyone. It is I, Mr. Shea, and we are looking at the second turning point in American history, World War One, also known as the Great War, the war to end all wars, and really doesn't get, I think, a lot of the publicity and a lot of the recognition that it should get as a really incredibly important event in American history, which is why we're looking at it right now. As always, homework videos for me are brought to us by tea. It is so warm on cold days like this. I love you, tea. Thank you. So, hopefully, you're drinking some tea right now, too. If you're not, well, I'm sorry. But World War One, let us go. So, before the war, the United States as a whole generally is trying to avoid foreign conflicts. They're really following the advice of good old George Washington, staying out of foreign entanglements, and they're doing it pretty successfully. Certainly, they're getting a bit more involved in Latin America and the Caribbean, a bit in the Philippines, but overall, the United States looks at what is going on in Europe. And remember, the majority of Americans are from Europe, and they see this long history of conflict, and they're really eager to stay out of that. So they prefer to stay a bit isolated from the rest of the world. And not only are they staying out of conflicts, but they are very purposely avoiding building up their military. The United States military, right at the start of World War One, if you look at this chart right here, the United States only has 200,000 active military members, whereas compared to places like France, which has 4 million. So the United States really looks at the military of saying, if we build up a very large military, it will encourage us to be more aggressive, more inclined to join conflicts. Whereas if we have a small military, then we don't really want to go into conflicts because we know we can't handle it as much. So before the war, the United States really is not a great military power. Before the war, socially, we have a lot going on, and especially socially is really a major turning point, which is why we have this video here. Yeah. So women before the war, certainly, if you look at this chart here, single women are working in decently large numbers, around a little below 50% of single women at 1900 are working. And if you look at married women, around 1900, very small numbers. However, if you look on this chart, and we'll talk about this a bit later, those numbers do start going up because of this war, and we'll talk about why. We also have, for African Americans in the United States, the majority are living in the South. If you look at this map here, this is the census data, 1900, and the shaded in areas down here, we're looking at percentages of African American populations. So the the racial makeup of the United States is geographically very concentrated in the South. Economically, right before the war, the United States is not actually doing very well. They had been in a recession for 44 straight months. So the country is okay, but isn't really a powerhouse when it comes to economics. And in the last video, we talked about the impact of the election of 1896, which really had incredible political and economic consequences to it, of the Republican Party very much favoring big business and big business owners. And one of the consequences of that is the income tax. And income tax had not been very new at this time. Income tax was not always in place in the United States, and it was very low. So right before the war, income tax was below 2%. So the United States was not getting a lot of its tax revenue from income at all. And in many regards, it's because people that were exceedingly rich didn't want it. And the government was very much in line with that. So what happens during the war? So in theory, my students, you have a bit of background on World War One of how it started, but just as a quick recap, we'll rush through this real quick here. In Europe, before the war starts, there's alliances. And alliances mean if someone gets attacked, then you will defend them if you are their ally. If you look at this map here, we have some major alliances between Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. And we also have alliances between the United Kingdom, France, Russia. So what happens is we have a group of terrorists. So if you look at this map here, we have Serbians. So there's a terrorist group known as the Black Hand. And I should step back. This is not just a terrorist group. This is a group of people that want independence for Serbia. They want to not be controlled by the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So they're very much freedom fighters. And as Americans years ago before this, we had the Sons of Liberty who used terror to put fear into the hearts of the British. And the Serbians, we have this group called the Black Hand, is intending to do the exact same thing. They want self-governance. So they hatch a plot to kill Archduke Franz Ferdinand. And this gentleman here firing the gun is this guy, Gavrilo Princip. And he assassinates Archduke Franz Ferdinand. He also kills his pregnant wife, Sophia, as their driver took a wrong turn and essentially drove right in front of where Gavrilo Princip was standing, having failed earlier that day to assassinate them with another plot. So because of this assassination, we have a rush of nations to follow up on their alliance agreements, and Europe is pulled very quickly into the Great War. Now, there's a whole lot more behind that. I'm not going to spend this video looking at all of that. We'll talk about more of that in my class, my students. So once the war begins, Europe is fighting. The United States, as we mentioned, wants to stay out of conflicts, and they do. They do very successfully. They do for 3 years. But eventually, the United States is drawn into World War I, particularly with the sinking of this ship, and my students were going to investigate the sinking a bit more in class, the Lusitania. The Lusitania is sunk by Germans, and it really encourages the Americans to get into the war because their people are dying now too. And once the United States gets into the war, this is really where the country starts to dramatically change, and a lot of what this video is looking at happens. So the United States, we have a huge amount of soldiers that are joining the war. Millions of Americans join the war effort, including these men right here. And not only are many white soldiers joining the war, but there are also many black soldiers. This is a unit called the Harlem Hellfighters. And black soldiers in the war initially were just used as really labor. They trained, they were prepared to fight, but the American military really didn't see them as, they didn't think they would be effective. They didn't think black soldiers would be able to fight as effectively as white soldiers. And eventually this unit get turned over to the French. They're like, we don't really want to use them. You can have them for France. And the Harlem Hellfighters ended up being one of the most decorated units in the war, and really showed the American military that their racial misconceptions of black soldiers were totally wrong. And these men had the ability to fight just as well as white soldiers. Women were also joining the war effort. So we had women that served as a variety of support members in the military. They weren't in the front lines fighting, but ambulance drivers. They're serving as nurses. They're serving in communications and really wanting to help the military as men do. And women were also, when it came down to it, not just in the military helping the war effort, but at home were helping build the weapons, the machines that were needed by soldiers in the United States, American soldiers and European soldiers of our allies, but they were in the United States working in factories. And if you look here, this is a assembly plant of creating some artillery shells. And if you notice, we have people wearing masks. And masks were not super trendy back then. However, at this time, we also have the 1918 Spanish influenza. So mask wearing was widespread in the United States to prevent the spread of Spanish influenza. And you'll see especially a lot of images from that era in the United States, those masks. So just like to point that one out. Domestically during the war, not only were women working in factories in the United States, but African Americans were very much recruited to work in munitions, tank factories, airplane factories. And they moved from the South, as we saw on that first slide, where the population of African Americans was in the United States, moving up north, where the majority of these factories were. And this doesn't happen all at once, but between about 1910, 1940, we have what's known as the First Great Migration, and it is the largest movement of humans in the history of the planet because of particularly jobs, but also just looking at the many ways overt racism of the South. African Americans really want to get out. Women during this time are really fighting for the right to vote, women's suffrage. And this is not a new fight. This has been going on for decades. But women are looking at the war saying, look, we are important. We are helping this war effort. And we're not just going to sit back and be quiet. We are going to continue protesting in front of the White House, as they are in this image, and really trying to get the president, Woodrow Wilson, to listen to them and advocate for their rights. There is, as we mentioned, there were low taxes, and then during the war, those tax rates suddenly increased. The United States realizes they need money, and certainly taxes provide a great deal of that money. The United States also sells war bonds, essentially telling the American public, hey, if you give us money, we will return that money to you with interest. And the U.S. is able to increase their output. They double their GDP, gross domestic product, all of the products they are producing during the war, which is incredible. So after the war, what happens? Good question. The world sees this war, and it's horrific. Between 9 to 11 million soldiers are killed. Millions more civilians are killed. The estimates range from about 25 million humans are lost in World War I. It is a horrific war. America loses 53,000 soldiers, which is certainly no small number. But you have nations like Russia that lose 1 million people. And people are really upset by this, and they should be. They're scarred by this. And Woodrow Wilson looks at it and says, maybe this is our chance for peace. And he and other leaders advocate for what's known or becomes known as the League of Nations, which, an image here, we have really a place where leaders can gather to discuss problems and not have it result in a great war. And that idea is this idea of collective security, that if we're all looking out for each other and we're all working together for the common good, then the security of ourselves will be guaranteed. Now, the United States is very skeptical of this. They didn't want to get into the war initially. They were kind of forced into it by the actions of the enemy. And after the war, the United States steps back and are like, all right, we were involved, but we still really don't want to get involved again. So the United States is pretty opposed to the League of Nations. They make a lot of cartoons of Woodrow Wilson and just kind of making him look like this dreamer and this idealism of bubbles that he's blowing here. And the United States does not join the League of Nations, which, when we get to World War II, is really a problem because we didn't sign on with this, in theory, great organization. Germany, on the other hand, they, at the end of the war, are punished severely. This cartoon here shows that they must pay for all these damages. So after the war, they are expected to repay damages and millions and millions and millions of dollars, which Germany itself had suffered immensely during the war, and it really struggles to pay back these debts. Which the result of that is, once the Great Depression hits, Germany is really in tough shape. People are starving, and it really provides the perfect grounds for Hitler to come along and say, hey, things are bad, but I'm going to make it better. You just need to give me power. And they do. And thus, we have World War II. That's a very short explanation of that, but it is one of the major factors that leads to Hitler's rise. Economically, the United States finds itself in great need of oil to power ships. the U.S. has to secure petroleum, and it really starts the United States on the course where we see it today as being dependent upon oil. And the rest of the world is no different, but this is really where oil starts to have national significance for national security, not simply just to power machines, but to power the nation. And that nation is powered very much by shipping. Before the war, the United States, in many ways, were dependent upon other nations to provide shipping. And after the war, the United States itself becomes a massive shipping power as well as a naval power. And that is a factor that continues to this day. After the war, socially, the United States does vote for prohibition. Alcohol is banned for sale, distribution, and production in the United States, except for medical purposes. And not only do they do that, but they do give the vote to women. Women are allowed by men, because remember, men are the only one that can vote on this. And so women are finally allowed by men to vote. And obviously, having 50% of the population now able to vote is important. However, remember, just because the women have the vote, we still have, as mentioned in the last video, disenfranchisement. So we're very much talking in most regards about white women here. When it comes to African Americans, they are still being intimidated at the polls. We have these voting tests and all these other things that really prevent them from voting. So certainly while the 19th Amendment is wildly important, it does take another 40 years for really the rest of the population that is not white to have the same voting rights as everyone else that is white. Speaking of race, we have millions of Americans that go over to Europe to fight. And those soldiers that are Black come back and really had fought and sacrificed for the United States. And there's some hope that a lot of that racism that they saw at home is going to alleviate itself a bit, as really it should. You know, they were heroes for the nation. And yet we have images like this of many smiling people. Look how happy they are. This is in Chicago. And all of these children are celebrating because they just burned down a home of a Black family. And race is very much continuing. As we mentioned, we have the Great Migration. So you have huge populations of African Americans moving north, and places like Chicago are not very happy about that. So we start seeing more conflict, but we also start seeing African Americans saying like, hey, you know, we have fought, we have died for the United States, and we're going to start standing up for ourselves more widespread than it had been seen in the past. And it really does spark this feeling of empowerment and advocacy and fighting back that continues through World War II and really leads us straight into the civil rights movement. So, huge turning point. Not necessarily things are better, but it does kickstart a movement that really finds a lot of success 40 years later. And obviously, we are not fully successful because we still have immense inequality in the United States. So we're still really following up a lot of what we saw happen in World War I today. Technologically, we have huge developments in the war. We mentioned last week the automobile as a massive innovation change and societal change for the United States. The telephone in World War I is started to be adopted widespread. We have a soldier here on a phone. And not only is it a telephone, which obviously for communication is glorious, but wars in general result in a lot of technological advancements. And a lot of these advancements are meant to kill people. However, those military purposes are usually adapted for civilian purposes. So we have images here of aircraft carriers, tanks, and planes and helicopters. So these are some images that really do, by the end of the war, a lot of primitive technology does get much farther advanced and really changes the way the United States and the world behaves technologically. So World War I, huge turning point. And the next turning point we're going to be checking after this is the Great Depression and the New Deal. So we will see you then. My students will see you in class, people on the interwebs. Until next time, farewell.